in hindsight, this wasn't just a process of me learning about a faith in an academic kind of sense. This was a process of me dismantling everything that I knew about the world and myself, not just Islam.
Screaming, Allah!
Assalamu alaikum, guys. I hope that your first week of Ramadan has gone very smoothly. Today we're going to be talking about not a very smooth subject at all. I'm going to be talking about my convert story. Why I haven't shared this story before is because I don't feel like it's inspirational. When you go online and you look for convert stories, usually people are looking for something really inspirational. They're going to cry during watching it and they're going to leave with a really uplifted feeling. I can't really promise any of that. Don't expect some kind of magical story like I walked into the masjid and I saw a light shining down on the Quran and I suddenly was a believer. Like it didn't happen that way. It was slow and it was long, and it's been going on, you know, for the last 7 years, I guess. So yeah, this is a story. So from a very early age, I remember not believing in God and being quite certain about that. You know, I was exposed to religion in the sense that people around me were religious, but, you know, in a very Church of England kind of way, in a very you know, I've mentioned it before, in the UK we tend not to speak about religion. There's like, it's on a range of subjects that we don't tend to talk about in very polite society, kind of. It's not like for polite conversation, because people can get heated and get emotional about it and things. So, you know, maybe that's an aspect of it, but I wasn't exposed to very direct people practicing religion. So there's a difference between having faith and then actually practicing religion. But, you know, when I was very young, I remember going to Sunday school, maybe when I was like 4 or 5 years old. We have this thing in the UK, Sunday school tends to happen after the church service. You go along to the church as children and you learn, you know, basic stories from the Bible. And I remember going along to that and really liking that they gave out sweeties while we were having the lessons and things. But I also remember kind of feeling quite strongly that I didn't believe what they were telling me is to be true. And, you know, I might have been influenced, I don't know, I don't remember, but I might have been influenced by other children telling me, oh, God doesn't exist or something like that. But as far as I'm aware, it came from me. And then later on, when I was in primary school, I remember saying to my mum that I wanted to get christened, because I wasn't christened. I wanted to get christened. Mum was quite surprised by this because, you know, I think maybe she knew how I felt about God or religion and things. But she was, you know, she was happy with that and she was supportive, and she kind of said, well, why, you know, what's brought this on? Why do you want to be christened? And I said, well, because I'm the only one at school who isn't. And that was kind of like, you know, oh, you know, I said it and I realized that that wasn't a very good reason to become christened. So we didn't get me christened. You know, and there's a lot of experiences that I had growing up that maybe, you know, they're not the most positive experiences, and they really did cloud the way that I viewed faith and the practice of religion. And I don't really want to get into talking about those things and my negative encounters. So let's just leave it that I had some bad encounters with people trying to convert me and things like that. So, you know, I already had this mixed feelings and this kind of like almost tumultuous relationship with faith, being very kind of strong in that I didn't believe in God, and that, you know, organized religion is a whole concept and all of these, you know, quite teenage type things. And then despite that, when I was about 14 or 15, I remember very clearly going through a stage. It wasn't a short stage, it went on for quite a long time, where I started actively speaking to God in no real capacity. And you know, the thing is that I grew up thinking of God as a man in the sky with a staff, you know, the Simpsons picture of God. That's kind of how I saw God. And then when I was 14, 15, maybe 16 years old, I started to speak to God, but it wasn't God. You know, I didn't give it a name. I didn't give it any kind of thing. It was just, I didn't think of it further than that. I was just talking to something and finding comfort in something. And I was kind of interested in pursuing that, but I didn't really know how to. And then I remember I spoke to a friend about it once, and he really laughed at me, like, what are you talking about? Suddenly you believe in God, like what is this? And I never spoke about it to anyone again since then. And then, so fast forward, you got the picture that I was quite firm that I didn't believe in God, but I was also kind of confused about this. And also I think that when people take on these really, really strong beliefs against something, I feel like sometimes that indicates that they are struggling with something else, or they're struggling to deal with that in some way. Then I met my husband, my now husband, and it was a real shock to me because I didn't know that he was Muslim when I first met him. There was nothing about him to tell me that he was Muslim. I served him bacon and he very kindly refused to eat it, and I didn't really know why he didn't want to eat bacon, but it didn't cross my mind for a second that he might not eat it for religious reasons. And then later on, it came up in conversation in a very natural way, and I was really shocked because I had a perception about Muslims and about Islam, and he did not fit it. And yet he was practicing Muslim and very certain of his belief. He answered any questions that I had, and I had a lot of questions. I wanted to know the answers behind 9/11. I wanted to know the answers behind Boko Haram. I wanted to know the answers behind hijab, because I hated hijab. I wanted to know the answer behind halal meat, because I was certain that this is some kind of torture for animals. And all of these things. And, in a very moderate, in a very thoughtful and calm way, he talked me through everything, every question that I had. He answered them. And, every stage I was like, okay, well, that's not, it's not quite the impression that I had, but okay, this is interesting. Like, I'm not scared off by him. I'm not scared off by the religion. He's a normal person. He's intelligent. He's living his life in a normal way, and he happens to be Muslim. Okay. And, it took a long time to explain things to me, because it was, we were dismantling a whole lifetime of stereotypes and perceptions that I had, and we had to kind of go back to the basics and really, it took a long time to explain a lot of the things about Islam to me. But I wasn't about to convert, and I was very clear about that, and my husband respected that. And he taught me how to be respectful of all religions as well, because honestly I wasn't being respectful of any religion. And then I came to Jordan, and that wasn't going to change. I was still very clear that I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not anything. But here in Jordan it's very hard to say that. So he introduced me as a Christian, and people said Happy Christmas to me and Happy Easter to me, because of course, celebrate all of those events in a cultural way, not in a religious way. And I said Happy Eid to them, and everyone was very respectful, and it was all very it was just a lot of mutual respect. But the thing that changed, so the next thing, the first thing was meeting my husband, and then the second thing was that once I was in Jordan and I was surrounded by people practicing faith, whether Christian faith or Muslim faith, because I was at the time, the first few years that I worked here in Jordan, that I lived here in Jordan, I worked for a Christian organisation. So, I was exposed to religion on a broad sense. And I realised at some point in the first year, I do believe in God. But it wasn't, it was just that I believed that there is a God, and it didn't go further than that. And I decided, I have to pursue learning about religion, because I'm in a religious country, and because I have married a religious man, and I'm surrounded by people who practice religion. So I started. If we were going to start a family, then I needed to be respectful of my children as well, and be as knowledgeable as I could for their sakes. Even though at the time I still had this really quite immature notion that we wouldn't raise our children with any faith, that they would choose their faith when they grew up and they were old enough to make a decision for themselves, because I didn't want to brainwash our children or something like that. When I look back at that, and I think it's so funny, because it was such a kind of immature way of looking at faith, and it just really showed that I didn't understand what it is to have faith and to practice religion. So I continued reading the Quran over this period of time, even though being very, very clear that I wasn't converting or anything like that. And you know, I think one of the things with my conversion story is that every stage in this story is punctuated by me overcoming some disbelief that I had. So the first one was God. The first one was, I realizing I believe in God. The second one was like, okay, well, do I believe in Jesus? Do I believe in the Prophet Muhammad? Do I believe in, you know, and like this. And when I confronted myself with this question, do I believe in the Prophet Muhammad? I said, no, I don't believe. And I had to put a pin in that and come back round to it, because I couldn't get my head around it. He was new to me and I didn't know him. And it actually, as it turns out, he became, so my first step was believing in God. The final step, I went through all of these different steps. The final step was me realizing, you know, I believe in the Prophet Muhammad. And I just think that that's really beautiful, that the first step was punctuated by God, and the final step was punctuated by the Prophet, you know, and everything else that came in between was kind of, you know, it was just like filler material or something. So, you know, the second thing, I had to come across like angels. Well, I was like, well, I don't really believe in angels. And then I started to read about angels and learn about jinn, and, you know, learn as much as I could and put it into different contexts and use different sources. And in the end I was like, okay, I believe in this. And then, you know, every step was like that. But this was a period, you know, this went on across 7 years. So every time I came up against a point that it didn't work in my head, I couldn't agree with it, or I just couldn't understand it, then I would go away and I would learn about it. And this is how I learned not just to accept the faith on behalf of, you know, the people around me and respecting the people around me, but I saw the beauty in it, and it was that it made sense. So in hindsight, this wasn't just a process of me learning about a faith in an academic kind of sense. This was a process of me dismantling everything that I knew about the world and myself, not just Islam, not just the stereotypes I had about Islam and Muslims. It was about dismantling everything I knew and learning everything afresh. And, you know, I look back on it and I'm really, you know, it was a huge thing going through that. And, you know, it was emotional turmoil, and it wasn't all highs, you know. It wasn't this beautiful thing like walking in the masjid and seeing the Quran glowing and, you know, saying La ilaha illallah. It wasn't as simple as that. It was punctuated by so much struggle and so much learning and so much effort. And I had to visit all of these places in my mind that were uncomfortable, and I had to go through all of these different changes and just revisit all of these different things. And it wasn't inspirational, it was slow, and it was quite arduous. But I think that the lesson that has taught me, that's the most important lesson for me personally, is that the faith is a journey, and it's not always easy. Sometimes it's really hard. So like I said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the last step for me. You know, I'd covered everything, you know, with, you know, all the obvious things, not everything, but I'd covered all of the obvious things that I wanted to kind of grapple with. And then I came back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I was like, well, where do I begin? And someone told me, read the biographies, learn about him within a context. So I read 3 biographies. I read a biography by a Muslim. I read a biography by a historian claiming to be objective, but was very subjective and not very polite. And I read a third one by a very well-grounded, objective historian. And at the end of these 3 books, I was completely convinced by him. And there was no more that needed to be done. I was like, well, I believe in God, and I believe in the Prophet, and I believe in the Quran, and I believe in all the in-between, and everything else that I may struggle with, and I come across verses or things that don't make sense to me and all of these things, and sometimes, you know, you have your doubt, like, wow, does the Quran really say that, or did the Prophet really say that? And then you go away and you read about it and you learn and you put it in context, and, you know, it's just a really beautiful thing, and you're never going to finish this journey. During this period, Islam, the word itself, transformed from being synonymous with terror and oppression, women's oppression especially, to the reality, which is that it's synonymous, well, no, it literally means peace. And the funny thing is that it really appealed to this hippie side of me from my childhood, and this very loving side of me that I don't really tap into very much. So while I've become increasingly conservative and increasingly, rational and logical during this process, I've also really tapped into all of these really loving hippie things that my mother tried to instill in me. These feelings that I've always had about loving the world and loving the earth and all of these things. It all fits together really, really beautifully with my perception of Islam and the way that I want to practice Islam. So I think it's just really beautiful because it's so complex that you can hold these two things that you might think of as being antithetical, like really loving, really beautiful feelings, and very logical and very practical things as well. So yes, I was convinced, and it was around Christmas 2019 that I finally said the words out loud to my husband. It had been going around in my mind a lot. I had to come to terms with it myself. It was a huge change to go from really not believing in God at all, and then identifying completely as a Muslim. So eventually I came out and I told my husband, and he was so shocked. He just didn't expect it at all. He thought all of the research that I had been doing was purely for the kids' sake. I don't think that he thought for a minute that I was actually in the process of converting. So yeah, when people say like, oh, you converted for your husband, it's really it couldn't be further from the truth. But essentially that is my story. There's a lot more to be said, and there's a lot more in between, but that's basically the bare bones of the story. And I know that I've rambled on a lot, and I know that my audio hasn't been recording for the whole thing, so fingers crossed this isn't going to be terrible audio for you. But yeah, that's the end. So I hope that this was interesting for you in some way. And inshallah, I want to talk a little bit more about this throughout Ramadan, inshallah. Yeah, so I hope that you're having a good Ramadan Kareem, and ma'a salama.